Dr. Jacob Matthew, the principal of St. Berkman's College, Tanganacheri. Reverend Dr. Thomas Padiath, the manager, St. Berkman's College, Tanganacheri. Father, you also gave an interesting lecture on classical philosophy. I liked it. Thank you for the lecture. Dr. Benny Matthew, the vice principal of the college. Professor P.J. Thomas, the head of the Department of English. The conveners of this online course in philosophy, Dr. Raju Sebastian and Dr. Robin, Dr. Sabu, Reverend Dr. Teddy, Professor Joshi, Mr. Nitin, Mr. Amal, Mr. Anish, and other friends in the Department of English at St. Berkman's. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you. At the outset, I would like to convey my gratitude to the Department of English at St. Berkman's, in particular to Professor P.J. Thomas for having invited me to deliver a lecture on hermeneutics as part of this online course in philosophy. This morning when we had a rehearsal, I told Professor P.J. Thomas that he is doing exceedingly well as the head of the department. I'll substantiate my argument. During the lockdown period, he has been organizing a number of programs with nationally renowned and also internationally renowned speakers. And it is in this sense that I would like to call him a dynamic and energetic head of the Department of English. For the outset, I would like to thank the department, in particular the head of the department, Professor Thomas, for this warm invitation to deliver a lecture on hermeneutics. Dear friends, I have prepared a PowerPoint on hermeneutics, and I would take something like 75 minutes, that is 1 hour and 15 minutes. After that, I think maybe another 20 to 30 minutes for some questions and for some discussion. Please allow me to share my screen. Can you see my screen, Dr. Benny? Yes. Okay, fine. Now, dear friends, I have divided my presentation into 3 units. And these are the 3 units, what you see on the screen. In the first unit, I will be talking about the etymology of the term hermeneutics. And I will also be offering a few definitions of the term hermeneutics. And I will also trace the development of hermeneutics over the years. And this will constitute the first unit of my presentation. In the second part of the presentation, which constitutes the core of my lecture, I'll be talking about 6 major hermeneutic philosophers. I'll be talking about their contributions. In particular, I'll be talking about the major concepts and theories. I'll be talking about Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Hirsch, Heidegger, Gadamer, and Paul Ricoeur. So this would be the second unit or the second section of my presentation. And I will conclude my lecture with an introduction to literary hermeneutics. So this is how I have organized my presentation into 3 units. Now let me move on to the first part of my presentation. Now in the first part of my presentation, I would be talking about the origin of the term hermeneutics, and I will be throwing some light on the etymology of the term hermeneutics. Now, dear friends, something interesting happened a few years ago. I think this was at a refresher course, and I was delivering a lecture on hermeneutics. I asked one of the participants whether she believes in God and whether she prays every day. She said, yes, I firmly believe in God and I pray every day. Then my second question was, have your prayers been answered? Have all your prayers been answered? He said, yes and no. Some some prayers have been answered, some have not been answered. Then I teased her, maybe you do not pray intently, maybe you do not pray sincerely. She took offense at my remark and she said, no, 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 I pray intently, I pray sincerely. Then I told her in a jocular vein, maybe God doesn't understand your language. Maybe there is a linguistic issue. Maybe there is a linguistic problem. You pray in Telugu and probably God doesn't understand Telugu. I mean, she laughed and the other participants also laughed. Now, dear friends, I would like to talk about the etymology of the word hermeneutics. Now, interestingly, we have two theories concerning the origin or the etymology of the term hermeneutics. According to one version, the term hermeneutics has come from Hermes. This is the first version, and this has been talked about by E.D. Hirsch Jr. Now, the second version is the term hermeneutics etymologically has come from a Greek verb, hermeneuein. You can see it on the screen. Now, the question is, who was Hermes and what was his job? What was the assignment given to Hermes? Now, let me clarify. Hermes was a minor figure in the Greek pantheon. In Greek mythology, we come across Hermes, a minor god, and his counterpart in the Roman pantheon or in the Roman mythology would be Mercury. So in Greek mythology, we have Hermes, and in Roman mythology, we have Mercury. Though the names may be different, the task that was assigned to Hermes in the Greek pantheon and Mercury in the Roman pantheon was identical. Now, what Hermes was supposed to do was listen to human beings because he knew the language that was spoken by men and women and translate it and interpret it and convert it into the language of gods and goddesses. And on the other hand, listen to the divine figures because he knew the language of gods as well. He was doubly proficient. He was proficient in the language of the human beings as well as the language of gods and goddesses. So he would listen to the message of gods and goddesses and translate it and interpret it for human beings. In other words, he was a negotiator and he was a translator. He was an interpreter. So dear friends, this is one version concerning the etymology of the term hermeneutics. So according to the first version, the term hermeneutics has come from Hermes. Now, according to the second version, hermeneutics, if you look into the origin of the term, if you look into the etymology of the term, it has come from a Greek verb, hermeneuein. You can see it on the screen. And what does it mean? What is the meaning of the verb hermeneuein? It means to interpret. So dear friends, this particular slide has talked about the origin, the etymology of the term hermeneutics. Now in the next slide, I would like to offer you a few definitions of hermeneutics. Now the first definition has been taken from Dilthey, a German philosopher. The second definition of hermeneutics, I have taken it from an article called The Task of Hermeneutics, which was published in 1973. And this is by a French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur. Then the third one is my own favorite philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer. I have taken this definition from his book, Truth and Method. Now, Dilthey, I have a separate slide on Dilthey. So more about Dilthey, who he was, what are his major publications, what are his concepts and insights. I will talk about it a little later. Now, according to Dilthey, hermeneutics is defined as the methodology of understanding of recorded expressions. Now look at the last part of the definitions, recorded expressions. It could be a philosophical treatise, it could be a theological document, it could be a literary expression. So anything that has been written down, anything which is a recorded expression of your thoughts, of your ideas in writing. So what do you do with that? What do you do with the text? You try to understand it, you try to interpret it, and in the process, you employ a methodology. So according to Dilthey, hermeneutics would be defined as the methodology of understanding of recorded expressions. Now in 1973, in a journal called Philosophy Today, Paul Ricoeur published a very important article, one of the earliest articles of Paul Ricoeur. The title of the article was The Task of Hermeneutics. And in the same year, he came up with another important essay called The Hermeneutical Function of Distanciation, about which I will talk a little later. So according to Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, in his essay, The Task of Hermeneutics, which was published in the journal Philosophy Today, hermeneutics is defined as the theory of the operation of understanding of text. So similar to Dilthey, so we talk about text. It could be a philosophical text, it could be a legal text, it could be a theological text, it could be a literary text. So how do you understand the text? How do you interpret text? And what is the methodology that you employ to understand and to interpret the text? So that would be hermeneutics. So that is the second definition of hermeneutics. Now we go to the third definition of hermeneutics, and this is by a very famous German philosopher who was at one time a disciple of Martin Heidegger, Hans Georg Gadamer. He wrote a book with the title Truth and Method. This was in the year 1960, and the book was translated into English in 1975. So if you open the pages of Truth and Method by Gadamer, you come across this definition of hermeneutics: understanding itself. This is not a typographical error, because you get understanding twice, not once but twice. So this is not a typo. So according to Gadamer, hermeneutics would be understanding itself. In other words, now as students of literature, when we read a poem or when we read a novel or when we read a short story, we say, oh, now I understand the poem. Oh, now I have understood the short story. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you, what did you understand in this poem? So give me the content of the poem, give me the summary of the poem, or give me a few critical ideas about the poem. No, I'm not going to ask you about the content of the poem or the novel or the short story. Instead, I would ask you, when you claim that you have understood the poem, what did you mean by understanding? Okay, so this is self-reflexive. So according to Gadamer, in Truth and Method, hermeneutics is defined as understanding itself. In other words, when you claim that you understand something, when you claim that you have understood something, what do you mean by it? What do you imply by it? What do you signify by the term understanding? So dear friends, these are the three definitions of hermeneutics. Of course, you have other definitions as well, but I thought these are three important and three significant definitions, and that is why I talked about these definitions. The first one by Dilthey, the second by Ricoeur, and the third by Gadamer. Now, as students of literature, very often we raise questions like this. In other words, if you look at the title of this particular slide, it says, hermeneutics asks questions as such. Hermeneutics raises questions as such. So if you're involved in hermeneutics, if you're a student of hermeneutics, then what kind of questions do you raise? What kind of questions do you ask? Okay, so here is a sample. Here are some important questions related to any hermeneutical inquiry of text. What is understanding? What do we mean by understanding? When you say you understand a text, what do you mean by it? What do texts mean, particularly literary texts? Because we are all students of literature. Of course, this applies to philosophical texts and theological texts and juridical texts. So what does a text mean? And what is interpretation? And what happens in interpretation, in the process of interpreting a text? Could be a literary text, could be a theological text. What happens? What are the different stages? What are the different phases? What are the different processes that are involved in the task of interpretation? And what do you mean when you say, oh, I understand this poem, I understand this film, it was complicated, but now looking at it for the second time or looking at it for the third time, now I understand what the film says, what the film conveys. So what do you mean when you say, I understand this text? Now the next question is an important question. Now, as students of literature, we take up a text written in the 14th century, Chaucer's prologue to the Canterbury Tales, or a text written in the 16th century, an Elizabethan text, or a Shakespearean text, or maybe a text that was written some 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So which means there is distance, historical distance, because we are living in 2020 and Chaucer's texts were written in the 14th century. So there is historical distance. Not only is there a historical distance, but there is a cultural distance as well. Because I as a reader, I am anchored in the Indian culture, whereas Shakespeare, Chaucer, Milton, they were all anchored, they were all situated in the English culture, in the Elizabethan culture. So therefore, the question is distance, historical distance as well as cultural distance. Is distance a negative factor, an alienating factor that needs to be overcome or that needs to be bridged? And the last question, when I read a text, should I consciously try to recover the authorial intention? I have used the Latin expression mens auctoris. So dear friends, these are some of the important questions to be raised when you are a student of hermeneutics, and when you talk about hermeneutics, when you talk about understanding, and when you talk about interpretation. Now, this is the last slide of the first part of my presentation. Now, when you look at the history of hermeneutics, when you look at the development of hermeneutics, we come across three different phases, three distinct phases. Now, the first phase, hermeneutics was initially employed, even now, hermeneutics was initially employed to study the Bible, to understand the Bible, and to interpret the Bible. So therefore, the first phase was biblical hermeneutics. Okay, so this gained momentum, particularly in the 18th century, particularly in the Protestant tradition, when individuals wanted to understand and interpret the Bible on their own. So biblical hermeneutics or biblical interpretation. Now, what happened was, towards the end of the 19th century and the whole of the 20th century, they were interested in the methodology that was employed to understand the sacred scriptures. So that became philosophical. So the content was not so much on the text, but the methodology that was employed, the approach, the pedagogy. So that became philosophical. So the earliest phase of hermeneutics from a historical perspective is biblical hermeneutics. Then when they became interested in the concepts, the theories, the insights, it became philosophical hermeneutics. Now for the last 25 years, particularly after the publication of Zondi's article, The Limits and Tasks of Literary Hermeneutics, we are talking about literary hermeneutics, and I would like to say that literary hermeneutics is a fresh entrant to the field of literary hermeneutics. So dear friends, this is the first part of my presentation. And in the first unit, I have done three things. I have talked about the origin and the etymology of the term. I have talked about a few definitions of hermeneutics, and I have also traced the historical growth or the historical development of hermeneutics. So in the second part, which would constitute the core of my presentation, I would like to talk about 6 important hermeneuticians. Now, the first one is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Now, please look at the spelling. All these German names, the spellings are a little difficult. Okay, so the first one is, who is Schleiermacher? Okay, Schleiermacher was a German Protestant philosopher and theologian. And very important to our discussion is he is hailed as the father of modern hermeneutics. Why is he hailed as the father of modern hermeneutics? I'll give you the answer. But before that, I would like to focus on 2 important essays written by Schleiermacher. The title of the 2 essays by Schleiermacher are, number 1, General Hermeneutics, and the second one is Grammatical and Technical Interpretation. So Schleiermacher was a German philosopher as well as a theologian. And as far as hermeneutics is concerned, the 2 key articles of Schleiermacher would be General Hermeneutics and Grammatical and Technical Interpretation. Now, a short while ago, I said Schleiermacher is considered, he is hailed the father of modern hermeneutics. Why this title? Now, the explanation is very simple. Now, before Schleiermacher arrived on the scene, what was available was different types of hermeneutics or different brands of hermeneutics. I'll give you some examples. So they had biblical hermeneutics, they had philological hermeneutics, they had juridical hermeneutics. So what Schleiermacher did was he subsumed the different kinds of hermeneutics under a common rubric or under an umbrella term called the general hermeneutics. In other words, instead of talking about hermeneutics in a piecemeal fashion, in a piecemeal fashion, as applicable to the Bible, as applicable to the legal text, as applicable to philology, he said, let us talk about hermeneutics in general. And that is why he evolved what is known as general hermeneutics. And it is for this reason he is hailed as the father of modern hermeneutics. Now, the second question, what brand of hermeneutics or what version of hermeneutics did Schleiermacher follow? No, the answer is very simple. Schleiermacher followed a brand of hermeneutics known as Romanticist hermeneutics. So we have different versions of hermeneutics under philosophical hermeneutics. So philosophical hermeneutics would be the common rubric or the broad rubric. So under philosophical hermeneutics, you have Romanticist hermeneutics, you have ontological hermeneutics, and you have other versions of hermeneutics. So the brand of hermeneutics that was followed by, that was adopted by Schleiermacher was Romanticist hermeneutics. And what exactly do we mean by Romanticist hermeneutics? The answer is there in the next line. Now the question is, how did Schleiermacher conceive understanding? What was understanding? How did he understand the term understanding? Now for which I would use a German word, Nachbilden. You can see it on the screen, and it is pronounced Nachbilden. Now, incidentally, Schleiermacher was not the first one to use the term Nachbilden. His predecessor, his precursor, Friedrich Ast, A-S-T, Ast, he is the first one to use the term Nachbilden. So what is Nachbilden, the German term? It means two things. Number one, both are the same: reproduction or reconstitution. In other words, when you read a text, it could be a legal text, it could be a philosophical text for us because we are all students of literature. So when we read a literary text, a poem, a novel, or a short story, the primary purpose of our reading is to recover or to reconstruct the authorial intention. And this is what Schleiermacher meant by understanding. And it is for this purpose that he was called a Romanticist hermeneutics. In other words, when you read a text, you have only one intention. So the sole intention of any reader is to reconstruct the authorial intention, and that is understanding. Now, how do you proceed this? How do you proceed in this assignment? Because your purpose is, your intent purpose is to reproduce or to reconstruct the authorial intention. So the methodology is a grammatical approach and a psychological approach. So what is this grammatical approach? Now, if you're reading a Chaucerian text or if you're reading a Shakespearean text, so what you should do is you analyze Chaucer's language, you analyze Shakespeare's language, a scrutiny of the syntax and vocabulary of that particular author and of that particular period, the 14th century English or the 16th century English. That will give you an idea or as to how to understand and how to interpret the text. So that would be the grammatical strategy. The psychological strategy would be somehow you get into the shoes of the author, and once you get into the shoes of the author, how do you do it? Through empathy, through congenial empathy. You try to get into his or her mind as well, and thereby you can try to reconstruct or reproduce the authorial intention. Now, dear friends, you go to the last line. Now, Paul Ricoeur, he would talk of two decisive moments in the history of hermeneutics. I repeat, Paul Ricoeur, he would talk of two watershed moments in the history of hermeneutics, two decisive moments in the history of hermeneutics. So the first one is concerning Schleiermacher, and the second one or the other concerns Martin Heidegger, about which I will talk a little later. So he says, he calls it a Copernican revolution, a major breakthrough, a decisive moment or a watershed movement. So he says the movement or the passage or the transition from different types of regional hermeneutics, like biblical, like juridical, like philological, to a general hermeneutics, itself is a revolutionary breakthrough. And it is for this reason that Schleiermacher is considered the father of modern hermeneutics. So having talked about hermeneutics, I would like to go to the next person, Dilthey, who was a German philosopher. He has written a lot, not just on hermeneutics, on other things as well, because very interesting, as students of literature, we should know that René Wellek, in his multi-volume History of Modern Criticism, he has devoted a particular section on Dilthey, where he considers Dilthey as a multifaceted or a multidimensional thinker. So what are the different fields, or what are the different areas where he was an expert? So he was an expert in philosophy, in psychology, and he was not only a philosopher and a psychologist, I have it on my screen, he was a learned historian of ideas and feelings of philosophy and theology, even of law. So according to Wellek, in his multi-volume History of Modern Criticism, Dilthey was a multifaceted, a multidimensional thinker. Now, the question is, in what sense or in what way is Dilthey important or crucial to hermeneutics? And what is the article that I would like to recommend? Now, he has a book which runs into 18 volumes. Obviously, I'm not going to recommend it. Instead, I would recommend an essay by Dilthey, which is readable and which is also available. Now we have two translations. In one translation, the title of the essay is The Rise of Hermeneutics, and it was published in 1900. In some other versions, in some other translations, the essay is titled The Development of Hermeneutics. Anyway, so fine. Now, the next two questions, what were the important contributions of Dilthey as far as hermeneutics is concerned? So I have three answers. Now, the first one, Dilthey served as a bridge between 18th century Romanticist hermeneutics. I have already explained what is the meaning of Romanticist hermeneutics when I talked about Schleiermacher, trying to recover the authorial intention. So that is the sole intention of Romanticist hermeneutics. So what did Dilthey do? So Dilthey served as a bridge connecting or cementing 18th century Romanticist hermeneutics and 19th century philosophical hermeneutics. So he stands at the threshold of the 19th century philosophical hermeneutics, and the chief exponents of philosophical hermeneutics would be later in the 20th century. Heidegger, in particular Gadamer, and one of Gadamer's books is called Philosophical Hermeneutics. Now, the next 2 points are interesting. You have sciences, particularly you have the natural sciences like physics, like chemistry, like life sciences. And on the other side, you have humanities. Now, as students of literature, we belong to the second camp. Now, Dilthey would ask a basic question, would ask a fundamental question. What would be the difference, or what would be the distinction between sciences, natural sciences or physical sciences on the one hand, and the humanities on the other? How do they work? How do they operate? I have two German terms, Erklären for sciences and Verstehen for humanities. Now, Erklären would mean explanation, and Verstehen in German would mean understanding. In other words, the question is, how do sciences operate? The answer is very simple. Science explains phenomena through causality. And what is causality? When you talk about the cause and effect, we are talking about causality. Or for instance, there is flood and houses have been flooded. That is only the effect. So what is the cause? Heavy rains. And for heavy rains, what is the cause? Global warming. So cause and effect, causality. So how do physical sciences and how do natural sciences operate? They operate on the basis of causality, cause and effect. Whereas humanities, particularly the domain of literature, how do we work as students of literature? Understanding. We try to understand a poem, we try to understand an author, we try to understand the intention of the author. So therefore, the major contribution of Dilthey to the domain of hermeneutics is he raised two questions. How do sciences work, and how does humanity work? So sciences, they explain phenomena, whereas humanities, they try to understand phenomena. And if you go to the next point, Once again, he talks about humanities and sciences. I've used two German terms, Geisteswissenschaften and Naturwissenschaften. So Geisteswissenschaften would be sciences and Naturwissenschaften would be humanities. Now, what happened was Dilthey lived during a time when positivism and empiricism held sway. In other words, you look at sciences, you look at physics, you look at chemistry. So they deal with data, hard data, empirical data, observable data. So in that sense, they are positive sciences, they are empirical sciences. Now, as a student of literature, I don't have any statistical data, I don't have any hard data to work with. Okay. Now, interestingly, the whole world is moving towards sciences. Earlier, it was MA psychology. Now it has become MSc psychology. In some universities, earlier it was MA economics. Now it has become MSc economics. In some departments, earlier it was MA linguistics, but now it has become MSc linguistics. So it looks like the world is moving towards sciences, but I think as students of literature, we should strongly resist it, because I would not argue which is superior and which is inferior. But what I would like to say is these are two different ways of looking at phenomena. Fine. Anyway, the point is Dilthey lived during a period when positivism and empiricism were predominant and the humanities were under attack by the sciences. So therefore he said, if the humanities have to survive the onslaught of the sciences, the attack by the sciences, then it is better that they adopt the methodology of the sciences. And what is the methodology of the sciences? Working with data, working with hard data, working with empirical or observable or positive data. So dear friends, this is about the contribution of Dilthey. Next, I would talk about an interesting man, and he is our man. Now, why did I say our man? And he belongs to our tribe. Now, what do I mean when I say he is our man or our tribe? Now, Schleiermacher was a philosopher. Dilthey was a philosopher. Now, after Hirsch, I will be talking about Heidegger, Gadamer, Ricoeur. All of them are philosophers. But E.D. Hirsch, he was not a philosopher. He was into philosophy, but that's a different story. He belongs to our tribe, meaning a professor of English. So E.D. Hirsch, an American, a professor of English, and only this morning I checked the internet. The man is still alive, thank God. So the man is still alive, and interestingly, his latest book is called Knowledge Matters, which was published in 2016. Okay, fine. Now, as far as hermeneutics is concerned, he is a professor of English and he has written other books, particularly concerning literacy. Anyway, I will not go into it because I have to talk about Hirsch only from a hermeneutical point of view. So from a hermeneutical point of view, the two key texts or the two primary texts of E.D. Hirsch would be number one, Validity in Interpretation, which was published in 1967. And this was followed by another book 9 years later, that was 1976. And the title of the book is The Aims of Interpretation. Dear friends, I have two slides on E.D. Hirsch, not because he belongs to our tribe, but because he was a very controversial hermeneutician. So therefore, I thought I will devote two slides to E.D. Hirsch, and I have also given you two quotes, which I have not done for Schleiermacher and Dilthey. So both the quotes are being taken from his book Validity in Interpretation, which was published in 1967. So the first question is like, what kind of hermeneutics or what brand of hermeneutics did Hirsch advocate, did Hirsch follow? Now the answer is he was a staunch romanticist, and in addition, he was an intentionalist. Now I have already clarified the term romanticist with reference to Schleiermacher. So a romanticist or an intentional is one who argues that you read a text with the intention of recovering or reproducing or reconstituting the author's intention. That is why he is called an intentionalist, a romanticist. Through congenial sympathy, you somehow get into the mind of the author, the mind of poet, the mind of the theologian, and try to recreate or reconstitute or reproduce the authorial intention. Fine. Now, when we come to hermeneutics, we have to talk about two sets of terms, and this would be the major contribution of E.D. Hirsch. Now, the first set would be Hirsch talked about the distinction or the difference between meaning on the one hand and significance on the other. And in the following slide, he talks about the difference or the distinction between understanding on the one hand and criticism on the other. And he correlates these two sets. Okay, fine. Now, the first question, what does he mean by meaning and what does he mean by significance? Now, according to Hirsch, a text can have only one meaning. Okay, whatever may be the text, it could be a poem by Milton, or it could be a short story by James Joyce, or it could be a novel by Jane Austen, or it could be a drama by Samuel Beckett. Okay, so any text can have only one meaning. Okay, I'm sure some of you would like to raise a question because today we talk of plurality of meanings, we talk of multiplicity of meanings in the context of the death of the author. That as far as Hirsch is concerned, he is very strong in his stand. He says a text can have only one meaning, and this meaning is what the author willed into the text. In other words, the verbal meaning is to be equated with the authorial intention. The verbal meaning or the textual meaning is to be equated with, is synonymous with the authorial intention. So Hirsch makes it very clear, abundantly clear. Any text, any literary text, any text for that matter, not just a literary text, can have only one meaning, and this is to be equated, this has to be squared with the authorial meaning or the authorial intention. Now, what does he mean by significance? By significance, he says, the contemporary dimension or the contemporary relevance of that authorial meaning or authorial intention would be the significance of a text. Now you take King Lear, for instance, or you take Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, or you take Paradise Lost. What Milton meant in the poem, or what Shakespeare meant in King Lear, or what Chaucer meant in the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, that would be the meaning. Now, when you apply, let us say, King Lear to the Kerala context, or the Tamil Nadu context, or the Karnataka context, or the Indian context, or the African context, okay, because some years ago, King Lear in the Kathakali tradition. So according to Hirsch, that would be not meaning but significance. And he uses another term for significance that would be meaningfulness. So which means Hirsch argues that a text can have only one meaning, and that meaning is what the author intended to convey through the text. So the authorial intention is meaning, and the contemporary application of this meaning, he calls it significance or meaningfulness. And here is a quote from his book, Validity and Interpretation, which was published in 1967. He says, meaning is that which is represented by a text. It is what the author meant. He makes it abundantly clear, abundantly clear. A text is what the author meant by his use of a particular sign sequence. Not what you read into the text, no, what the author meant. Significance names the relationship between that meaning and a person or a conception or a situation. It always implies a relationship and one constant unchanging pole of that relationship with what the text means. So now that I have clarified meaning on the one hand and significance on the other, I would like to go on to the next set of terms, namely understanding and criticism. And the third step or the third strategy is how does Hirsch correlate meaning with understanding and significance and criticism. Okay. Now, I as a reader or you as a reader, what should you do? What should I do? As readers, what should we do if I can use the plural? So Hirsch says, first we should try to understand a text. And what does he mean by understanding? Try to recover the authorial intention, because he has made it very clear. The meaning of the text is not what you read into the text, but what the text means. In other words, what the author willed into the text, the authorial intention. And once I have recovered the authorial intention, then I don the mantle of a critic. So first I read, I understand the text. So that is phase one, that is step one, that is strategy one. And once I have done with that, then I move on to the next step or the next strategy, and that is to be a critic. So in other words, first I read and understand and recover the authorial intention. So that would be meaning and that would be understanding. The next I try to be a critic, wherein I talk about the meaningfulness or the significance of a text. And what he does is he correlates meaning with understanding or interpretation, and he correlates significance with criticism. And here are two quotes. So the first one, understanding and therefore interpretation in the strict sense of the word is both logically and psychologically prior to what is generally called a criticism. So you don't become a critic. You become a critic only in the second stage or in the second strategy. Prior to that or earlier, what you do is you are a reader and your job is to understand and reproduce the authorial intention. You are a critic only during the second phase. And he writes, the object of interpretation is textual meaning in and for itself and may be called the meaning of the text. Here is one more quote from the same book, Validity and Interpretation. The object of criticism, on the other hand, is the meaning in its bearing on something, standards of value, present concerns, etc. And this object may therefore be called the significance of the text. And finally, he rounds off the discussion with the homology. What meaning is to understanding, significance is to criticism. Now, the point is very interesting about Hirsch. According to him, a text can have only one meaning, and that meaning is the authorial intention. And when you apply this meaning to a given situation or a given context, a cultural context or a linguistic context or a religious context, then you're talking not of meaning, but of meaningfulness and significance. Now, very interestingly, Hirsch had a lot of opponents, a lot of detractors. And very interestingly, there was a long drawn debate between Hirsch and Gadamer. Hirsch accused Gadamer and Gadamer accused Hirsch. And it was a long drawn out debate. But basically, the argument is Gadamer would ask Hirsch, how do I dichotomize myself? So first you expect me to read the text in a neutral way, in a neutral manner, in a neutral fashion, so as to recover the authorial intention. Then I have to read as Joseph Duraraj, living in a particular time, living in a particular context, with a particular set of ideologies. So how is this possible? How do I dichotomize itself? So therefore, the argument of Gadamer would be understanding itself is interpretation. So therefore, it is needless to separate meaning from significance, because according to Gadamer and according to others, a host of other critics as well, later day critics, according to them, meaning is its own significance. Dear friends, next we come to a very important man, Martin Heidegger. I am sure as students of literature, you already have an orientation to Heidegger, because when you do absurd drama, I'm sure some introduction must have been given to you regarding existentialism. And when we talk about existentialism, we obviously refer to Martin Heidegger. Now, Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, considered the greatest of the 20th century, uh, considered to be the greatest of the 20th century philosophers, but not without controversies. He was a supporter of the Nazi regime, and later he was stripped of his rectorship and later reinstated. Anyway, I will not go into that story. Now, what is important for is in 1927, Heidegger came up with his magnum opus, and the title of the book is Being and Time. This was 1927. So the book was translated into English only in 1962. Look at the long gap, look at the long passage of time. Okay, so the book was translated into English only in 1962, and it was translated by Macquarie and Robinson. Now, very recently, I am not very sure. I think, yes, I have the detail with me. We have a recent translation of Being and Time from German to English. And this was done by a lady called Stambaugh. And the translation came out in 1996. Now, I am not familiar with the translation of Stambaugh, but I read Being and Time in the translated version of Macquarie and Robinson. Fine. Now, dear friends, the first page of Being and Time, you come across this quote. Now, what is this quote? The opening page of Martin Heidegger's Being and Time announces very clearly our aim, Heidegger writes, our aim in the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being. And that is why the title of the book is Being and Time. And what is the backdrop against which you will be talking about what is the meaning of being. He continues, our provisional aim is the interpretation of time as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. In other words, right at the outset, Heidegger makes it very clear. The focal point of my book is to talk about being, and I would do so against the backdrop of time. And that is why the title of the book is Being and Time, a voluminous book. I think I don't remember, but it should be easily 350 pages, easily. Fine. Now let us not worry about the second part of the title, the temporal dimension or the time dimension. I'll focus on being and how this leads to hermeneutics. Because earlier when I talked about Schleiermacher, I brought in a reference from Paul Ricoeur. In fact, I used the phrase of Paul Ricoeur, not my phrase, Paul Ricoeur's phrase, Copernican revolution. And I translated Copernican revolution as a decisive moment or a watershed movement in the history of hermeneutics. So according to Paul Ricoeur, when you look at, when you span the history of hermeneutics, you notice two decisive moments. And what are these two decisive moments and whom are they associated with? So the first breakthrough or the first watershed moment is associated with Schleiermacher, regional to general hermeneutics. And according to Paul Ricoeur, the second breakthrough in hermeneutics happened with the publication of Martin Heidegger. And what is that? Understanding is looked at not epistemologically, but ontologically. Don't worry, I will explain it in the following slide. Fine. Now, dear friends, the title of the book is Being and Time, and the entire book talks about being. Now, what is the spelling of being? Now, Heidegger uses two spellings. I'm not joking. Heidegger uses two spellings. B, a capital B, and uppercase, B-E-I-N-G, an uppercase or a capital B, and B-I-N-G, a lowercase or a small b. So what does being with a B uppercase mean, and what does being with a B lowercase mean? Okay, I will talk about it. But before that, let us go to Aristotle. So Aristotle in book 4 of Metaphysics, he defines being as science of being qua being. So the Latin term qua means as. Now later scholastics, Father Thomas Padayat, he talked about scholastics and scholastic philosophy, particularly associated with Thomas Aquinas, who was the greatest medieval philosopher and theologian, and later he became a saint as well. So scholasticism, so basically what Aquinas did was Aquinas borrowed a lot of concepts and theories from Aristotle, and the joke is he had baptized Aristotle anyway, fine. So now the scholastics would define being as the study of being as being. So which means we have two beings. I will not talk about the second being, but what is a being? Now, whether it is Aristotle or the scholastics, particularly Thomas Aquinas, a being is defined as that which is, I-S. He is, therefore he is a being. She is, therefore she is a being. This laptop is a being. God is a being. A table is a being. A rock is a being. A devil is a being. So it means that which is. So this is the Aristotelian definition and this is the Thomistic definition. So according to Aristotle and according to the scholastics, being is that which is, being qua being. Fine. Now, why this confusion about the spelling, a capital B and a small b? Now, I will not go into the German translation. The German translation is interesting. Now, what Heidegger means by being with a small b and what Heidegger means by being with a capital B is this. Okay. So anything that is a being. So I am a being, my laptop is a being, my wife is a being, Professor P.J. Thomas is a being, God is a being, my table is a being, the rock is a being, the ocean is a being, all are beings, including God. Okay. So whether God is a being with a capital B, Heidegger says no, but experts have talked about the ontotheological adumbrations, about which we will not discuss. So he says, so point one or stage one is everything that is a being. Point two, all beings, whether it is a plant or a man or a rock or a scorpion or a snake or an ocean or a god, all beings are in search of or moving towards being with a capital B. I repeat, anything that is a being, and all beings, okay, small b, lowercase b, all beings are moving towards or all beings are in search of being with a capital B. Okay, so it is in this context that Heidegger would use the pair ontological and ontic. Ontological is correlated with being, capital B, and ontic, that particular category is correlated or identified with being the small b. Fine. Now, the last line of this particular slide is ontological hermeneutics, and we go to the next slide. Now, the first line of this slide is understanding is ontological, not epistemological. Now, what is ontology and what is epistemology? Now, ontology talks about metaphysics. Ontology is part of metaphysics and it talks about being. Epistemology is one of the pillars of philosophy and it talks about theory of knowledge. Okay, now where will you place understanding? If I ask questions like what is knowledge, what is truth single or multiple, what is maya, what is illusion, would that come under the theory of knowledge or the theory of being? Would that come under metaphysics or would that come under epistemology? Is it an epistemological question or is it an ontological question? Now, except Heidegger, everybody else will say, every other philosopher would say, questions of understanding, they are bracketed under epistemology. But Heidegger would say, no, as far as I am concerned, as far as my book Being and Time is concerned, understanding is not to be interpreted in epistemological terms or epistemological categories. Instead, understanding is to be looked at from an ontological point of view. It is for precisely this issue that Paul Ricoeur would hail Heidegger's breakthrough in hermeneutics as the second Copernican revolution, the second Copernican reversal, a decisive moment or a breakthrough moment. Fine. Now let us come to the crucial point. What does Heidegger mean by understanding? The first question, and the second question, how or why does he align understanding with the ontological categories and not epistemological categories? So let me briefly explain. I have two quotes here. So let me briefly explain. Now, earlier, I talked about two kinds of beings. Beings with a small b. I am a being. My table is a being. A plant is a being. A piece of rock is a being. My two-wheeler is a being. And all beings are in search of being with a capital B. But there is an important distinction. There is a crucial distinction. The plant that I have at the entrance of my house, it is a being, and that is in search of being with a capital B. But according to Heidegger, it is not aware of the fact that it is in search of being. Now, the car that I have parked in my portico, it is a being. And that is also in search of being with a capital B. But unfortunately, the car is not aware of the fact that it is in search of being with a capital B. Whereas, on the contrary, I am a being, but being a human being, I am aware of the fact that I am moving towards, I am inching towards, I am journeying towards being with a capital B. It is in this context, please go to the last part of the discussion. Heidegger would say Dasein, Dasein. Dasein, a German word, would refer to man, but literally it means being there, thrown into the word in the Wellsein. So according to Heideggerian hermeneutics, Dasein, that is man. I'm giving a simple translation. So man, woman, human being is primarily being possible. In other words, I'm a being with a small b, but even though I am a being, I realize, I'm conscious, I'm aware of the fact that I'm moving towards being with a capital B. So which means I have some vague knowledge of what being is, what I am moving towards, what I am journeying towards. And Heidegger would argue Dasein is primarily being possible. Those possibilities and potentialities are disclosed in this world. And this disclosedness or disclosure is called understanding by Heidegger. So in other words, according to Heidegger, man exists understandingly. As teachers of English, as students of English, we would argue this is not correct English, okay? But philosophically, Heidegger would say, man exists understandingly. In other words, he looks at understanding not from an epistemological point of view, but from an ontological point of view. And this is a decisive watershed moment or a breakthrough moment in the history of hermeneutics. Dear friends, I have two more philosophers. I think I will speed up. So the next philosopher is my favorite philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer. The man lived for a long time. This only in cricket they score centuries. Okay, so this man, he scored a century and he died at the age of 102. So two important books, Truth and Method, originally published in 1960. The English translation came out in 1975. And very interestingly, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the subtitle of his book, Truth and Method, that was originally published in German in 1960. So the subtitle of the book is Elements of a Philosophical Hermeneutics. Now, why I emphasize this particular point is Gadamer was always interested in philosophical hermeneutics. So the next major book of Gadamer is Philosophical Hermeneutics. This is not a book as such. This is an anthology of collected or printed published essays. Now, you may not have the time or the energy to read either Truth and Method in the original or Philosophical Hermeneutics in the original because you need some time and some energy and also some philosophical orientation. Particularly, I'm addressing the students, the BA and the MA students. But instead, I would suggest another text which is accessible not only in the physical sense, but also in the intellectual sense. Now, what happened was in 1981 in Paris, at Goethe Institute, there was a colloquium involving Jacques Derrida and Hans-Georg Gadamer. So the two were brought together. I mean, representing two different schools of thought, Derrida representing the school of deconstruction and Gadamer representing the school of hermeneutics. So experts thought they would invite a dialogue or a conversation between hermeneutics on the one hand and deconstruction on the other. So the debate went on for 3 days. So this was in 1981. It is referred to as the Paris Colloquium. And in that platform, Heidegger presented an essay called Text and Interpretation. So I would strongly recommend this particular essay. Is only 20 odd pages, readable, and this would be a capsule version of Gadamer's major philosophical theories and insights. Fine. Now, in this particular slide, I have talked about number one, philosophical hermeneutics, and number two, dialogical hermeneutics. Fine. Now, even when I talked about the title of the book, Truth and Method, I drew your attention to the fact that the subtitle of the book is to do with philosophical hermeneutics. In other words, Gadamer makes it very clear he is not interested in proposing or advocating any methodology for understanding. He says, I would like to talk of understanding in general philosophical terms as Kant talked of understanding in a transcendental fashion. So that is why philosophical hermeneutics, because later critics found fault with Gadamer. They accused Gadamer. You say your book is Truth and Method, but you have not talked about any method to arrive at truth or to access truth. For which Gadamer said, no, 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 my book is transcendental. My approach is transcendental in the sense I'm more interested in the general issue of understanding, and I'm not interested in suggesting any way or any methodology of accessing truth. So that is philosophical hermeneutics. And the model that Gadamer adopted for his brand of hermeneutics is dialogical hermeneutics. So what happens when you dialogue with somebody? When A dialogues with B, when A has a conversation with another person, when a teacher has a conversation with a student, when a wife has a conversation with her husband, or when a husband has a conversation with a wife. So what happens? So he says, my brand of hermeneutics, my model of hermeneutics is structured on a dialogue. So what happens in a genuine dialogue? I'm not talking of false dialogues, which never take off in the literal sense. So in a genuine dialogue, in an authentic conversation, what happens is you give up your position to some extent. The interlocutor, the other person also gives up his or her position to some extent. You negotiate, and as the phrase goes, you meet halfway through. Okay, so that is the meaning of dialogical hermeneutics, and this is exactly what was proposed by Gadamer. So the major hermeneutical insight of Gadamer is he looks at understanding a literary text, understanding a theological text, understanding a philosophical text as the fusion of horizons. What does he mean by fusion? Bringing together of two horizons, synthesis of two horizons. Okay, fine. Now, straight away, I would like to clarify when you talk about the fusion or the bringing together or the synthesizing of two horizons, straight away, I would like to clarify what are the two horizons. Please remember, Gadamer does not talk about the author, the death of the author. So he says the dialogue is not between the author and the reader. Instead, the dialogue is between the reader and the text. When I read a Chaucerian text, when I read a Shakespearean text, when I read an Eliotian text, I'm talking to the text. I'm dialoguing with the text. I'm trying to have a conversation with the text. So when he talks of the fusion of horizons, we have to bear in mind the two horizons would be the text and the reader. So in every reading activity or in every reading endeavor, the reader, he or she tries to get into a dialogue or a conversation, a genuine and authentic conversation with the text. Now here the point is, in the first part of my presentation, I raised an important question. Is distance, spatially, culturally, linguistically, historically, is it a negative factor? Is it something forbidding? Is it something of a hindrance? Okay, so is distance to be negotiated? Is distance to be bridged? Is distance to be overcome? Now, there are two ways of looking at it. If we ask the romanticists, if we ask the intentionalists, they would argue, yes, distance is a negative factor. The further away the author is, the more difficult it becomes to understand and to interpret a text. Whereas in the case of a living author, it is easy to access the text is because when you don't understand the text, you can always ask the author and find out what he or she meant by it. So distance is a negative factor as far as the romanticists are concerned, as far as the intentionalists are concerned. But for the anti-intentionalists, distance is not to be construed as a negative element or as a limiting factor. It could be a productive dimension because the greater the distance, there are greater possibilities of interpretation. And he says, when you have a genuine dialogue with the text, when you have an authentic conversation with the text, what happens is your perspective and the perspective of the text, some way, somehow, they coalesce, they synthesize, and this is exactly what he means by the fusion of horizons. And this is the major insight of Gadamer as far as hermeneutics is concerned. So, dear friends, we come to the last major philosopher as far as hermeneutics is concerned, Paul Ricoeur, who died in 2005. Okay, so Paul Ricoeur, he's one of my favorites. And in Europe, he is the hot favorite because if you go to philosophy institutes in Europe, I think they are all engaged with the thoughts, ideas, and insights of Paul Ricoeur. So, by way of introduction, I would like to point out that Paul Ricoeur was a multifaceted personality. Now, what do I mean by this? Please allow me to substantiate my point of view. He was a philosopher, a theologian, a preacher, an exegete, a literary critic, a linguist. Please read his book, The Role of the Metaphor, running to more than 300 pages, a narratologist, his 3-volume Time and Narrative. So he was truly a multifaceted personality. But unfortunately, this is something very intriguing, but unfortunately, he did not garner as much attention as his colleagues. So Derrida was his colleague, Foucault was his colleague, Barthes was his colleague, and Derrida was flamboyant. Foucault also was flamboyant, but Paul Ricoeur somehow did not get as much attention as his colleagues got. And maybe one reason is Paul Ricoeur was perceived to be a man of the establishment, pro-establishment. So therefore, unlike Derrida or unlike Foucault, like he never shot into the limelight. Anyway, fine. Now, the major aspect of Paul Ricoeur as far as hermeneutics is concerned, please go to the second paragraph of the slide. He talks about triple distanciation. In fact, in 1973, earlier when I gave you the definition of hermeneutics, I referred to the journal Philosophy Today. The year was 1973. So Paul Ricoeur published two essays, two articles. So the first one was The Task of Hermeneutics. So that was the first one. And immediately after that, he published another essay, The Hermeneutical Function of Distanciation. It is here he talks of distanciation, and this he has carried on throughout his life, particularly in his book. Please look at the second line. This is his major book as far as hermeneutics is concerned. Interpretation, Theory, Discourse, and the Surplus of Meaning, originally based on 4 lectures delivered at Texas Christian University, and later they were put together, they were compiled and brought out as a book. So this is his major book as far as hermeneutics is concerned. Okay. Now the point is, what does Paul Ricoeur mean by triple distanciation? So if you can explain this, then I would have explained Paul Ricoeur's theory of hermeneutics. Now, dear friends, take my own lecture, this online lecture. The platform has been provided by SB College, Changanacheri. So you take my own lecture as an example, as a model, as an example, model in the sense of an example. So I am the author, I am the one who is delivering the lecture. And those of you who are watching this live, whether it is on the Zoom platform or on the UT platform, you are the original reader or the original audience. And the context is a week-long online course in philosophy organized by the Department of English, SB College, under the chairmanship of Professor Thomas Fine. So which means I have clarified 3 things. Who is the author, who are the recipients, and what is the original situation of discourse. Fine. Now, after this online lecture, the organizers, the Department of English, SB Changanacheri, they upload it in the YouTube. And imagine 3 months from now, or 6 months from now, or two years from now, somebody is watching it. Somebody is watching the YouTube version of my online lecture on hermeneutics. Now, what happens? When somebody is watching the YouTube version of my lecture on hermeneutics, there is triple distanciation. So the first distanciation, I am not there. So the author is absent. The original presenter is absent. The second distanciation, the original reader, the original audience, they are not there. Somebody else is watching, maybe from Kerala, maybe from Delhi, maybe from Germany or France. And the original situation of discourse also is absent. So this is what Paul Ricoeur means by triple distanciation. Now, this triple distanciation, distanciation from the author, distanciation from the original reader or the original audience, and the distanciation from the original situation of discourse, is it something negative or is it something positive? Is it something unproductive or something productive? So triple distanciation, what are the advantages? What is the positive factor? What is the plus factor about triple distanciation? Now, Paul Ricoeur would say, semantic autonomy. I repeat, because of the triple distanciation, what are the three dimensions of the triple distanciation? Distanciation from the author is absent. Distanciation from the original reader or the original audience, you are not there. And the original situation of discourse. What is the original situation of discourse? A platform has been provided wherein experts talk about philosophy and the interface between philosophy and literature. So this is the original situation of discourse. So because of triple distanciation, there is semantic autonomy. And where there is semantic autonomy, there are possibilities for polyvalence and for a plurality of reading. So this is basically the argument of Paul Ricoeur, wherein he talks of the positive effect or the positive dimension of triple distanciation. So dear friends, I have completed the second part of my presentation. So in the second part of my presentation, I highlighted the major concepts, theories, and insights of number one, Schleiermacher, the father of modern hermeneutics, Dilthey, who serves as a bridge between 18th century and 19th century hermeneutics, E.D. Hirsch, who talks about meaning and significance, and also in the same breath, understanding and criticism. Then I talked about, I unraveled the ontological hermeneutics of Heidegger. I talked about the philosophical hermeneutics of Gadamer, and I highlighted the triple distanciation of Paul Ricoeur. I said I will talk for 75 minutes, so I have exactly 5 minutes more. I have exactly 5 minutes more. So let me go to the last part of my presentation, wherein I will introduce literary hermeneutics. Now, by way of introduction, I would like to talk of macro hermeneutics on the one hand and micro hermeneutics on the other. Now, this has been beautifully illustrated by a theologian called Genre. So his book is Biblical Hermeneutics. So the second part of his book talks about biblical hermeneutics, but the first part of the book, the introductory part of the book, talks about philosophical hermeneutics. So Jean Rand in his book Theological Hermeneutics, he would talk of number one, macro hermeneutics, and number two, micro hermeneutics. So he says macro hermeneutics is something general, something universal. He talks about philosophical hermeneutics. Macro, it talks about individual disciplines, individual areas, individual domains like theological hermeneutics, juridical hermeneutics, philosophical hermeneutics, literary hermeneutics. So therefore, literary hermeneutics is a part of micro hermeneutics, but then it is subsumed under the rubric of macro hermeneutics. Fine. Now, dear friends, I would like to make an observation when I talk about, I would like to make two observations when I begin to talk of literary hermeneutics. Number one, now it is only for the last 20 or 25 years that we have been talking of literary hermeneutics. So therefore, literary hermeneutics is a recent entrant into the domain of hermeneutics. Now, having said that, I would like to point out that we do not have many books or many articles on literary hermeneutics. In fact, I have come across only one book that has been translated from German to English, and the author is Zondi, an introduction to literary hermeneutics, but actually the first chapter is actually an essay that he had published in one of the journals. Okay, fine. So this is about literary hermeneutics. So literary hermeneutics would come under micro hermeneutics, and micro hermeneutics as such would be subsumed under macro hermeneutics. Fine. Now, very quickly, I would like to talk of six major dimensions or six major hermeneutics, sorry, six major characteristics of literary hermeneutics. So the first one, pre-understanding. Heidegger would call it force structures and Gadamer would call it prejudice. Now, what exactly do I mean by it? Please read this statement. No reader approaches the text with a blank or neutral mind, but with some pre-understanding, however tentative or provisional it may be. So this is called a pre-understanding. Now, when I take a novel in my hand, when I take a poem in my hand, when I take a drama in my hand, I do not approach it with a neutral mind. I already have some pre-understanding. Okay, so this is what is meant by pre-understanding. Heidegger would call it four structures of understanding, and Gadamer would call it prejudice. But then please note, I have typed something in red. Now, this pre-understanding is not to be construed, not to be misunderstood as a approaching a text with some preconceived notions. No. Okay, so you approach it with an open mind, but at the same time, not with a neutral mind. So this is the first aspect of literary hermeneutics. Now, the second dimension of literary hermeneutics is we have the concept of the hermeneutic circle. And originally, this hermeneutical circle was put forth by Ast, and later it was appropriated by Schleiermacher, but the explication was done by Martin Heidegger in his book Being and Time. So what is this hermeneutical circle? So the hermeneutical circle is when you know the whole, WHOLE, the parts become clear. And conversely, when the parts are understood better, then you have a better understanding of the whole as such. So this is a circle. The Thistleton, in his book, The New Hermeneutics, would say, instead of the metaphor of the circle, he says the metaphor of the spiral would be better. So in other words, I said earlier when I talked about Gadamer's fusion of horizons, I said reading a text is like having a dialogue with the text. So what happens in a dialogue? Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Ultimately, there is a synthesis. So this is the meaning of hermeneutical circle. And the third characteristic of literary hermeneutics is the debate, the ongoing debate between intentionalists on the one hand and anti-intentionalists on the other. As students of literature, we are all familiar with essays like The Death of the Author, From Work to Text, both by Roland Barthes and the one by Foucault, What is an Author? So that would be the anti-intentionalist stance. So who are the intentionalists? As far as hermeneutics is concerned, the intentionalists are Ast, Schleiermacher, Detaille, Getty, and E.D. Hirsch Jr. And what is their argument? You read with the sole purpose of recovering the authorial intention, whereas Heidegger, Gadamer, and Ricker, they said, you forget about the author's intention, and they belong to the anti-intentionalist camp. So the fourth characteristic of literary hermeneutics would be the reading process. In biblical hermeneutics, they talk about subtilitas intelligenti, subtilitas explicandi, and subtilitas applicandi. In other words, application. Okay, when you talk of the birth of liberation theology in South America, what did they do? They took the Exodus, the story of Exodus, the metaphor of Exodus, and then they transplanted it in the oppressive climate, the oppressive political, ideological climate of South America, and that is how liberation theology was born. So application to a given context. So this is taken up by literary hermeneutics. I have a beautiful quotation, but unfortunately there is no time. I have to wind up. So the sixth characteristic of a literary hermeneutics is understanding a text is like entering into a dialogue, entering into a conversation. It is in this context that I would like to draw your attention to another interesting concept by a philosopher as well as a literary critic. Gauss, Gauss, pronounced Gauss, he talks about the horizon of expectation. Okay, so he belongs to the school of reception aesthetic. So you have the reader response theory, you have the American school, you have the German school. So he was a disciple of Gadamer and he promoted the horizon of expectation. And the last one is Gadamer towards the end of his book, Truth and Method, he says, future generations will understand differently what you have read into the text. In other words, you can never say this is the meaning of the text. There can be no finality to understanding or to interpretation. It is an ongoing process. So dear friends, that marks the end of my presentation. So in the first part of my presentation, I talked about the etymology of the term. I talked about the questions that are raised and addressed by hermeneutics, and I also talked about the three phases in the history of hermeneutics. In the second part of my presentation, I talked about the contribution of Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Hirsch, Heidegger, Gadamer, and Paul Ricoeur towards the end in the last part of my presentation. I very briefly, I'm sorry I have not done justice to literary hermeneutics. I talked about very briefly about the 6 characteristics of literary hermeneutics. Now, before I wind up, I would like to suggest some important books. Now, I have a book. I'm sure you can see it on the screen. It is titled The Philosophical Hermeneutics. It was published in 2011. But the best book is, please go to the penultimate entry. The penultimate entry, it is a book by Richard Palmer. It is one of the earliest books to come out on hermeneutics. The year is 1969. The title of the book is Hermeneutics, the subtitle is Interpretation Theory in Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Heidegger, and Gadamer. So anyone who wants to plunge into hermeneutics, I would heartily recommend this book. Then, of course, you have other books as well. So dear friends, I said I will speak for 1 hour and 15 minutes. I have taken 7 more minutes. I'm sorry about it. But I take this opportunity to convey my thanks and gratitude to the Department of English at SP, particularly Professor Thomas and my friends Benny Matthews, Sabu, Josie, Raju Sebastian, and others for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful lecture. Now we'll be moving on to the question answer session. For the smooth conduct of the session, Nikhil and I'll be reading out selected questions from the chat box alternately. We'll open today's Q&A from a question from Naresh Sharma. He's asking...
One second, hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, please proceed.
Okay, we'll open today's question from
Yes.
From the question from Naresh Sharma. He's asking, what is the difference between hermeneutics and exegesis, and how hermeneutical process work when we critique a text? Is it an art? So
Okay, fine. So this is an interesting question. The distinction or the difference between exegesis on the one hand and hermeneutics on the other. Now, this is talked about in biblical hermeneutics. So when you try to interpret the Bible, they talk of exegesis on the one hand and hermeneutics on the other. Now, there are 2 answers. Okay, so the first answer is exegesis is different from hermeneutics. So that is the first answer. The second answer is no, exegesis and hermeneutics, they are not 2 different dimensions. They are like 2 sides of the same coin. Fine. Now, what is exegesis and what is hermeneutics? Fine. Now, today is Sunday, so some of us would have gone to the church. Okay, so you had a passage from the Bible. Okay, so a parable was read out in today's gospel. Okay, so in Jesus's time, in that particular environment, in that particular context, what did it mean? So that would be an exegetical study. Now, when you try to interpret it, when you try to give it a contemporary dimension and relevance, that would be hermeneutics. So if you ask the scripture experts, if you ask the Bible experts, they would talk of exegesis on the one hand and hermeneutics on the other. Exegesis would talk about meaning at that time, the original meaning. So during the time of Jesus, what did this parable mean? So that would be exegesis. Now, when you apply it to today's context, the contemporary dimension, the contemporary relevance, that would be hermeneutics. But today they would say they are not two different things, but two sides of the same coin. So exegesis leads to hermeneutics.
Okay, sir. Thank you for that response. The next question has raised.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear you properly.
Am I audible, sir?
A little louder, please.
Am I audible?
Yes. One
Okay.
second, 1 second. I will. One second, I will increase the volume. Okay, please go ahead now.
Okay, sir. The question has raised by Professor P.J. Thomas.
Okay.
The question was, in hermeneutics, imagination dominates than methodology. Your comments, please, sir.
If imagination dominates methodology.
Yes, sir.
Imagination dominates methodology. Now, what I would suggest is, now it depends on the philosopher. If you take Hirsch, for instance, he is more interested in talking about methodology. He talks about stage one, that is meaning and significance. Then in stage two, he talks of understanding and criticism. So as far as Hirsch is concerned, as far as Schleiermacher is concerned, yes, they are interested in the methodological dimension. Okay, so as far as these two are concerned, just to give you two examples. So one is Schleiermacher, the other is Hirsch, E.D. Hirsch Jr. They are more interested in talking about a methodology. They want to help readers. They want to enable readers. But on the other hand, if you go to Gadamer, for instance, he makes it very clear. My brand of hermeneutics, my version of hermeneutics is philosophical. I would like to talk of hermeneutics. I would like to talk of understanding in general, transcendental, as we talk of Kantian phenomenology. Okay, so as far as Gadamer is concerned, methodological issues are not as important as theoretical, imaginative, discursive issues. So therefore, the answer is, for some, methodology is primary, whereas for some, methodology is not primary. Instead, there are other questions which are more important than methodology as such. Next question, please.
Okay, sir. The next question is from Professor Josie Joseph.
Yes.
Listening to your lecture, I was reminded of the famous Monte quote with which Derrida opens his celebrated 1966 text. We need to interpret interpretation more than to interpret things. I wish to apply this to your explication of hermeneutics itself. Why do you consider only the conservative text of hermeneutics and not deconstruction, which is the most radical, rigorous, and important form of hermeneutics? How I wish you had talked more about Derrida than E.D. Hirsch and his indefensible arguments.
Okay, fine. Okay, thank you, Josie. That's an interesting observation. Now I have two answers. Now the first answer is a facile answer. Now Derrida, at least in philosophical circles, Derrida is looked upon as a deconstructor, as a literary critic rather than a hermeneutician. Whereas Hirsch is considered a hermeneutician, even though he is a professor of English. But Derrida is not considered a proper hermeneutician, even though he has contributed to hermeneutics. So this is my first observation, and that is the reason I didn't talk about Derrida. But in fact, I have published an article on hermeneutics and deconstruction based on the Paris colloquium that took place in 1981 under the banner Text and Interpretation, which went on for 3 full days, wherein they tried to be, actually the conversation didn't take off along expected lines, but but there was an attempt to bring together Derrida and Gadamer, meaning there was an attempt to bring together deconstruction on the one hand and hermeneutics on the other, represented by Gadamer. Now, your question as to why I left out to Derrida, I have two answers. So the first answer is, as I said earlier, from a purely philosophical point of view, Derrida is not considered a hermeneutician. So that is my first answer. Now, my second answer, now the meeting point between deconstruction and hermeneutics is rather slippery, because Derrida would accuse Gadamer, if you go to the debate, the 1991 Paris Colloquium, the debate between Gadamer and Derrida, which was later published in the form of a book edited by Michel Felder and Palmer, along with other articles, Derrida makes it very clear that Gadamer talks of a logocentric metaphysics, whereas he talks of a deconstructive metaphysics. So therefore, there was no meeting point, even though they tried to bring about a rapprochement between hermeneutics on the one hand and deconstruction on the other. They could not meet at a point of convergence. So it is in this sense that Derrida is not looked upon as a major hermeneutician. So instead, he is looked upon as a deconstructor, but yes, a deconstructor par excellence.
Can I just add to it, sir? Joseph here.
Please go ahead.
That's exactly why I gave that Montaigne quote, which Derrida, gives at the beginning of a structure, sign, and play. We need to interpret interpretations. Now, how do you interpret hermeneutics? If you say that Derrida cannot be considered a hermeneutician, now, then what is hermeneutics? If hermeneutics is a philosophy and theory of interpretation, right? Yeah, I think this is a very logocentric pitching of hermeneutics, where you don't want to consider any of these postmodern or radical interpretations of the theory of interpretation, that you just want to hold on to that logocentric, traditional, biblical tradition of hermeneutics, which I find very problematic coming from you, because you're such a great, fine scholar of deconstruction as well.
Oh, thank you. Okay, now my answer is this. Now the answer is Derridian deconstruction ultimately ends with the conclusion that texts are slippery. They do not have any final meaning, and that is why the metaphor of the bottomless chessboard is used by Spivak and by Hoy and others. So in other words, deconstruction would argue, Derrida would argue, there is no meaning as such, there is no interpretation as such, everything is slippery. But on the other hand, Gadamer, for instance, would argue the text does not have a single meaning, it has multiple meanings, and there is no finality to interpretation. So he goes halfway along, he goes halfway to meet Derrida, but then he makes it very clear, unlike Derridian deconstruction, Gadamer would argue the text has a meaning, but that meaning is not final, whereas Derrida would say there is no meaning as such. You have only signifiers and signifiers, an endless line of signifiers. So there is a crucial difference between Derrida on the one hand and Gadamer on the other. Even though there are points of convergence, there is a clear divergence as well. The point of convergence is both argue that you should not settle down for one single magisterial or authoritative interpretation. You should be open. But where they differ is, Derrida would say we have only signifiers. Signifiers and signifiers, a long line of signifiers with no signified, whether it is a linguistic signified or a transcendental signified. But whereas Gadamer, even though he went along with Derrida to some extent, he parts company with his friend Derrida, and then he says, no, I'm sorry, I believe that texts have a meaning, maybe not finality as far as interpretation is concerned, but they do have some meaning. So therefore, there is convergence and there is divergence as well when we talk of the conversation between hermeneutics and deconstruction.
Sir, thank you so much. But can I also chime in with the question because it's getting really exciting and I
Yes,
think
yes, please.
relevant for the times. So since we're talking about deconstruction and the general reputation that the reader seems to have,
Can you please introduce yourself?
I'm Vimal, sir. I'm also a colleague of Professor Joshi.
Okay, okay. Yeah. Yes, Vimal, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about the general disrepute that the Redian philosophy has apparently fallen into quite recently, particularly with respect to the rise of conservatist positions and politics and so on. So my question is that when you consider this general debate of on the one hand the question of interpretations and meaning making, even perhaps a logocentric re-understanding of conservative bias coming into academia and politics and so on, and on the other hand you have this question of perhaps thinking of uh, dismantling many of these positions taken and advocated by Derrida. Are you comfortable with the general trajectory that this things that the academy and politics in general seem to be taking today?
Okay, now I think I need some time to answer the second part of the question. But anyway, let me go back to Derrida. Now, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the presentation of the 1966 lecture, Structure, Sign and Play at the Discourse of the Human Sciences at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, your department, the Department of English at SP, you had organized a one-day seminar, and thankfully you invited me, and I'm grateful to the department for that. So I gave a talk on Derridian deconstruction. And if you remember, if you can recall, this is how I concluded my talk. This is how I concluded my presentation. After talking about Derridian deconstruction at length, I raised this question: is Derrida a nihilist? Is Derrida a negative philosopher? Because when Derrida died, if you look at the obituaries were divided. Some considered him a negative philosopher, a nihilist who advocated that there is no meaning, whereas the others would argue that no, he is not a nihilist, he is not a negative philosopher, he is a positive philosopher. And I made my stand very clear. I said, I would consider Derrida a positive philosopher. So personally, what did Derrida teach me? So what Derrida has taught me is to believe strongly, not to settle down complacently with any meaning and argue and proclaim, yes, this is finality. As a teacher, I should not tell my students, this is the poem and this is the interpretation and this is the only way of looking at the poem. You cannot look at it differently. You cannot have any other interpretation. You cannot have multiple interpretations. No. What Derrida has taught me is, Derrida is certainly not a negative philosopher. He's certainly not a nihilist. What Derrida has taught me is, do not settle down for any meaning and claim that meaning to be the final meaning or the final interpretation. That is one of the many meanings. Okay, so this is what Derrida has taught me. Now, if you ask me what is my position as far as interpretation is concerned, my philosophy and my theory of interpretation would argue and we claim that basically truth is multiple, truth is plural, truth is not single, truth is not univocal, but it is multivocal, not even equivocal, it is multivocal, it is polyvalent, it is plural. So whether it comes to language or culture or religion or ideology, I believe in plurality, and that is my stance, my perspective, and my position.
Thank you, sir. One more thing to add. We have quite a lot of questions lined up, but I'm not really sure if we really have the time. So could you tell us how much time you can continue answering questions for?
No, I think you should ask Professor P.J. Thomas how much time you have, and maybe I
He
can
would-
take another 3 questions.
All right, that would be great. Yeah. So
Fine,
okay,
fine.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you for that informative response. The next question is from Arun DM. Sir, can you explain the essential difference between hermeneutics and phenomenology?
Okay, I think the next lecture in this series is on phenomenology. Yes, I think that is to be delivered by Dr. Robin. So what I would suggest is, You please hold on and ask Dr. Robin. Anyway, I will answer, but just one second. Okay, I have the reference, but I don't know where. Now I refer to Palmer, Richard Palmer. Richard Palmer has written one of the best books, one of the best introductory books on hermeneutics. Now he has written an essay. I mean, I need some time to locate the essay, but anyway, just 1 minute. Okay, fine. I have it here. In fact, I would strongly advocate that all those who are interested not only in hermeneutics but in phenomenology, you please read this essay. This essay was published in the year 1973. It was published in a journal called Cultural Hermeneutics, and the title of the essay is Phenomenology as Foundation for a Postmodern Philosophy of Literary Interpretation. I repeat, this is an essay by Palmer, P-A-L-M-E-R. The title of the essay is Phenomenology as Foundation for a Postmodern Philosophy of Literary Interpretation, published in the year 1973. Fine. Now, what is the major argument or what is the thrust of Palmer in this article? I'll put it in 2 sentences, fine. Now he says there are 2 ways of looking at a text. Now, a Cartesian philosopher, one who follows the tradition of Descartes, a Cartesian philosopher who is mired in, who is steeped in subject-object dichotomy, he would look at a text as an outsider. So which means there is a distance, there is a gap, there is an estrangement between the text and the reader. This is the subject-object dichotomy which was advocated by Descartes. So we talk of the Cartesian rift between the subject and the object. So how do I look at a text? How do I read a poem? I can look at a poem as an object, just as I look at a material object like a table or a chair or a laptop. So I can consider a poem, I can consider a novel, I can consider a short story also as a material object. It doesn't impinge me, it doesn't influence me, it doesn't provoke me. So I look at it as a text. So this would be the Cartesian dichotomy, the rift or the cleavage between the subject and the object, the dualistic metaphysics. Now, phenomenology, on the other hand, and Palmer would suggest a phenomenological approach to literary text as a remedy to heal the Cartesian dualism, the dualism brought in or triggered by Cartesian philosophy or Cartesian metaphysics. So he says, don't look at a poem as an object, as he would look at a table, as he would look at a chair, a material object. So if you look at a poem or look at a novel as a material object, then you can't relate to it. On the other hand, the subject and the object, the dualism has to be erased. You try to have a dialogue, you try to reach out to the poem, you try to have a dialogue with it, you try to have a conversation with it. And this is exactly what Husserl talked of in his phenomenology. So he said, the basic slogan of phenomenology was back to things themselves, because earlier they were given to abstractions, they were given to speculative philosophical abstractions. So Husserl said, enough of these metaphysical abstract speculations, back to things themselves. And phenomenology talks about a one-to-one personal relationship, particularly with the dimension of intentionality that was talked about by Husserl's teacher, Brentano. So therefore, my answer is the Cartesian metaphysics looks at a text as an object. And once you look at a text as an object, obviously you cannot relate to it in a personal manner, in a personal dimension. So to heal this rift that was brought in by Cartesian dualistic metaphysics, Palmer advocates a phenomenological approach where you do not look at a text as an object. Instead, you look at it as something with which you can enter into a dialogue or a conversation. Okay, so this is my answer. maybe more about phenomenology from Dr. Robin in the next session, because he has an entire session on phenomenology and he is an expert on phenomenology and I'm not.
Okay, sir. The next question is from Philip Jose. Sir,
Yes.
to what extent is hermeneutics a customizable framework for culture or literary studies? Also, what is the rationale for using hermeneutics to exegete literary or cultural texts?
Okay, now there are two answers. Let us not differentiate texts on the basis of whether it is a literary text or a cultural text or a theological text or a philosophical text. Now, hermeneutics talks about text. Okay, so it is the hermeneutics of the text. It is not the hermeneutics of the cultural text. It is not the hermeneutics of the theological text. So hermeneutics, from a broad point of view, from a broad horizon or from a broad perspective, it talks about hermeneutics of the text. It could be a cultural text, it could be a literary text, it could be a philosophical text, it could be a theological text, and so on. Now, the point is, when you talk of hermeneutics in relation to literature, now, when I talked of literary hermeneutics, unfortunately, it is my mistake. I didn't have time to talk about all the 6 dimensions or characteristics of literary hermeneutics that I had originally intended to talk about. For paucity of time, I could not. I mean, that is my mistake. I should have organized my time better. But anyway, as I mentioned it, now literary hermeneutics has just entered the field. Originally, hermeneutics, if I can use this term, originally or even now, hermeneutics is confined to seminaries. I think when Father Thomas Padiyat was making his presentation, somebody asked him, I think it was Jitin, because Jitin was my student. He asked Father Thomas, like, why is it in the seminary they teach philosophy? And Father Thomas gave a beautiful answer. He talked about the Trinity, and then he says existentially they are different, but essentially they are the same. So he says philosophy serves as the handmaiden for theological study. So what happens is, even today, hermeneutics is confined to seminaries. It is taught in philosophies and theologies, not so much in departments of English. So in fact, I would like to congratulate Professor Thomas, because he has initiated a discussion on hermeneutics and he has embraced hermeneutics not just as a philosophical discipline, but as an academic discipline as well. So I think it is left to people like you and people like me to involve more and more hermeneutical principles in the understanding and in the interpretation of literary texts. So this is a potential field for research, not only for research, like for a lot of projects. Okay, so that is my answer to your question.
Thank you, sir. This is our final question of our Q&A session.
Okay.
The question has raised by Girish C.
Okay.
Is hermeneutics a binary domain of presupposed ideas on text and meaning in relationship with authorship?
Okay, no, in fact, I had a slide on this. In fact, when I talked about in the third part of my presentation, when I wanted to, actually, I didn't do it. When I wanted to talk about the 6 dimensions or the 6 characteristics of literary hermeneutics, the second point was I wanted to talk about pre-understanding, and I did mention that in Heideggerian terminology, this is known as 4 structures of understanding, FORE, and in Gardnerian terminology, it is referred to as prejudice. So in other words, now when you take a text in your hand, when you take a novel, when you take a drama, when you take a short story, now you ask this yourself and then you try to elicit an answer from yourself. Do you approach it with a blank mind, with an empty mind, or okay, even if it is an unknown book, by looking at the title, by looking at the blurb, by looking at the author's name, or by looking at the table of content, or by looking at the publisher, who is the publisher? Okay, so you already have certain initial questions or initial thoughts about the text. So which means you do not approach the text with an empty mind or blank mind. You approach it with some pre-understanding. No, it is only pre-understanding. It is not final understanding. So pre-understanding, it is only tentative. It is only provisional. Okay. So you take up a novel, a new novel by a new author, by looking at the title, by going through the blurb, by looking at the table of contents, you have some pre-understanding. But when you're on page 30, or when you're on page 47, or when you're on page 48, you realize that what you originally thought and what the text unfolds or unravels, it is different. So therefore, what do? You revise your pre-understanding. I thought the novel would be like this, but now I realize it is different. Or you tell yourself, when I started, I had a hunch that this novel would be something like this, would unfold in this particular pattern. I'm happy like my hunches have come true. So in other words, Gadamer and Heidegger and Gadamer would make it very clear. Two things. Number one, you do not approach a text, whether it is a literary text or otherwise, with a blank or a neutral mind, but you already approach it with some pre-understanding. In fact, there is a beautiful quotation by Bultmann, Rudolf Bultmann, taken from New Testament and mythology, but unfortunately, I don't have the time to talk about it. So pre-understanding is a prerequisite for any understanding or any interpretative endeavor. But I would like to underline and I would like to clarify, this is only pre-understanding, not final understanding. Because it is pre-understanding, it is tentative, it is provisional, open to change, open to revision, open even to throwing it out because it may not fit in with the scheme of things. So this is the meaning of pre-understanding. So therefore, it is not binary.
Thank you, sir. It's now time to end the Q&A session. Although we have a lot of questions, unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all of them. We thank you all of you for the wonderful questions and the participation. We ensure that these questions are forwarded to the speaker through mail.